And to the Middle East, where it is now over 111 days of war between Israel and Hamas, but a permanent end still seems far from sight. The United Nations says heavy fighting has encircled 2 hospitals in Han Yunis, and this has left thousands of terrified staff, patients, and displaced people trapped inside. We'll have the latest details in our next report.
The Israeli military has reportedly demolished hundreds of buildings near its fence with Gaza as it seeks to create a buffer zone in clear defiance of the United States' demands. The International Committee of the Red Cross has warned that immediate action is required to prevent a complete shutdown of medical services in Gaza. According to William Scomberg, who is the head of the ICRC's office in Gaza, every functioning hospital in the Gaza Strip is overcrowded and short of medical supplies, fuel, food, and water. Many are housing thousands of displaced families, and now more facilities risk being lost due to the fighting. End of his quote. On the flip side, Qatar has rebuked Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, after he allegedly criticized the country's role as a mediator in the Gaza war as being problematic in an allegedly leaked recording. According to an Israeli news outlet, at a meeting this week with the families of captives being held in Gaza, Prime Minister Netanyahu blamed Qatar for financing Hamas and said he was upset at a decision by the United States to extend the presence of a military base in the Gulf state. In November, Qatar helped in securing a 7-day pause in fighting in Gaza, during which 110 Israelis and foreign captives were released from Gaza in return for 240 Palestinians freed from Israeli custody. The leadership of Qatar and Egypt are currently working on a new plan that could set more captives free.
And joining me now via Zoom from Belfast in Northern Ireland is the Executive Director, Centre for Peace, Democracy and Development, Professor Darren Q. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me back.
Now, there's been another broker ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas. Both Israel and Hamas have been swapping proposals for that agreement, but both sides are nowhere near an agreement. What do you think a realistic proposal will look like?
Well, I don't think they're quite as far away from an agreement as you suggested. I think there's some important, perhaps, trade-offs here that both sides are in favor of. Most especially, it looks like there's some sort of understanding about returning the Israeli hostages to Israel in exchange for release of Palestinian prisoners. I think that piece is probably an important part of this. Second is some sort of understanding, at least about a temporary or longer ceasefire for humanitarian aid to be allowed to get in even further into Gaza. I think the big sticking point is going to be over Hamas itself. I mean, clearly, the Netanyahu government has stated very clearly that one of its objectives is the removal of Hamas. Now, we've heard reports that the Israelis actually offered Hamas leadership safe passage out of Gaza in exchange for some more comprehensive peace proposal, but that Hamas leadership rejected that. The other issue is that the Israelis clearly want some sort of increased buffer zone in Gaza where they will station troops to make sure that something like the October attacks does not happen again. Hamas, of course, is against that. I think the trade-off there is going to be some sort of deal over a remainder of Hamas leadership in power in Gaza in exchange for some sort of acquiescence of that border zone in Gaza. But we still have a long way to see whether that's going to go forward.
And we also know that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has rejected a two-state solution and hasn't come up with any other alternative. And you say that it is not that far in terms of getting an agreement or reaching an agreement. What do you think? You've mentioned some other areas where you think is going to be a challenge, but isn't that also a challenge, the idea of rejecting a two-state solution?
Yes, I would be very surprised if the two-state solution were part of any kind of agreement between Hamas and Israel at this point. I think the two-state solution will have to come out of some sort of a longer peace process that will involve, certainly American mediation in that. Though this is a big problem that is happening now, of course, is the rift between Washington and Israel. Netanyahu very clearly rejected the two-state option after President Biden of the United States had made it clear that this is something the United States sees as important for peace in the region. Healing that kind of rift is going to be important, but the problem is with the American elections looming in November, the Biden administration is not in a very strong position to push Israel too far on this. I would fear that a more comprehensive peace process may have to wait until after the American elections and may hinge upon sort of a Biden victory at that point.
We heard recently from Finland's foreign minister, who said that the time for Israel's self-defense is over. She also criticized the Israeli government for failing to protect civilians in the Gaza Strip, and then called for an immediate ceasefire. And this is not the first time we're getting criticisms from countries allies with Israel. Is Israel at risk of a rift with its allies?
I think, as I said before, the biggest rift is actually with the United States at this point in time. I think that's the one that Israelis are most concerned about. Of course, they are concerned about European allies as well. I would say countries like Britain and others are in that batch that the Israelis are certainly still trying to keep in some sort of friendly arrangement. I think the other thing we need to watch over the coming days is that the International Court of Justice is hearing a suit brought up by South Africa accusing Israel of genocide in Gaza. The court will not rule on genocide right away, but the possibility that the court might try to order some sort of immediate ceasefire, or at least some sort of call for increased humanitarian aid. If that happens, that will also, I think, increase Israeli isolation among its allies and create even further pressure for this, which is going to meet up with pressure that's coming from within Israel on Netanyahu. There's been increased pressure for him to call an election once the conflict is over. And clearly, opinion polls are showing that he is not likely to win such an election.
And I want to get to the humanitarian aid in just a moment, but we've seen escalation in the Middle East. Extremist groups are also exploiting this situation. What could happen if all attempts to broker an immediate ceasefire agreement fails?
Well, I think this is certainly going to be increasingly unstable across the region. Iran has seen an opportunity, I think, to gain ground on Israel and has encouraged its allies in Lebanon and in Yemen, the Houthis, as you mentioned, to increase their activities against Israel and against shipping in the Red Sea. At the same time, Iran itself has also come under attack from opponents of the regime that are based in Pakistan and in Iraq. So they are under pressure as well, I think, to try to end at least this cycle of violence. If we don't have an agreement fairly soon, I think that's only going to continue. And the longer that those sorts of attacks continue, the possibility for miscalculation and increasing spread of this conflict definitely increases. So I think that pressure as well is going to be coming down on the Israelis to try to come to some sort of deal with Hamas. We'll see what happens.
And there are now talks, especially from the U.S., about post-war plans. And as you look at the crisis in Gaza and the situation in Gaza, what do you see to be the scale of humanitarian crisis and requirements in that area?
Well, I mean, the scale of humanitarian requirement is massive. We've seen massive displacement of the people in Gaza. Of course, the number of Palestinians dead is more than 20 times that of the amount of Israelis that have died in this conflict. We've seen most of the hospitals, if not all the hospitals in Gaza, to my understanding, have been shut down or are in ruins. So it's a humanitarian nightmare. There's going to need to be some sort of action soon in that regard. And I think that in more than anything is probably pushing pressure for some sort of settlement soon. What we might see is a 2 or 3 step process. A first step where there is another short-term ceasefire that involves more prisoner exchanges and allows more time for the mediation to try to see if a more comprehensive ceasefire can come. And then, as I said, the third step that may come is some sort of longer-term peace process, but I'm not too optimistic about that until perhaps after the American elections.
I guess the big question everyone will want to see answered is who takes responsibility for rebuilding Gaza. We'll see how that plays out. Thank you so much for talking to us. The Executive Director, Center for Peace, Democracy and Development, Professor Darren Q.
Thank you so much.
And now to Asia, where North Korea says it has conducted its first test of a new generation cruise missile in continuation of its zeal to expand its military capabilities. The official Korean Central News Agency says the missile is strategic and still in its development phase. Although North Korea has not specified how many missiles were fired, the test reportedly had no impact on the security of neighboring countries. Tension on the Korean peninsula have increased in recent months as North Korean leader Kim Jong-un continues to move ahead with his weapons development program. You're watching The World Now. We'll take a break and return with more stories from around the world.